Imagine you are shipwrecked on a desert island. Can you picture it? Good. Now, imagine there is no water, no wildlife, no shelter, and worst of all, imagine there aren't even any trees. How long do you think you could survive? 1 night? 2 nights? Maybe you've watched Bear Grylls and thought, you know what, I can drink my own I could survive a couple weeks? How about 15 years? That is what the Malagasy slaves who washed up on this tiny little island in 1760 achieved, and this is their story. Welcome to The Blair Itch, the show that scratches that scary stories and true crime itch that maybe you just can't reach. Yeah, maybe you should see a doctor about that. Today we're going all the way back to 1760 to hear an incredible story of survival and human endeavour. A story so unbelievable, it'll make you question the limits of the human body. This is the story of Sand Island. In the year 1761, a French merchant ship known as the Utile set sail on what would become one of the most tragic voyages in maritime history. What started as a covert mission to transport enslaved men, women and children from Madagascar would end up in shipwreck, betrayal and an incredible tale of survival. The Utile was captained by Jean Lafargue, a man driven by profit. The ship was bound for the French colony of Ile-de-France, or what we know today as Mauritius. Though the French East India Company had banned the slave trade in its territories, Lafargue and his superiors had other plans. In the dead of night, they loaded the ship with over 160 enslaved Malagasy people, defying French law. The Malagasy people are the inhabitants of Madagascar, an island nation off the east coast of Africa in the middle of the Indian Ocean. They're an ethnically diverse group of people with origins that trace back to Southeast Asia and East Africa, and then later on migrations from Europe and the Middle East. Now sadly, during the 17th and 18th century, the Malagasy became a significant source of slavery for the trans-Indian slave trade, which is how the Malagasy in this story found themselves aboard the ship Utile in the first place. Captain Lafargue and his first officer, Barthélemy Castellan du Vernet, knew the risks, but the profit from the illegal human cargo was just too tempting to pass up. With the wind at their backs and greed in their hearts, the Utile embarked on its fateful journey. A few weeks into their voyage, disaster struck. On the night of July 31st, 1761, as the ship sailed through treacherous waters near Sand Island, Captain Lafargue made a critical mistake. Despite warnings from his first officer, Lafargue insisted on sailing too close to the reef, and then it happened. The Utile struck the reef with brutal force. The ship's hull shattered and chaos erupted on board. As the ship listed violently and began to rapidly fill with seawater, both the crew members and approximately a third of the Malagasy on board managed to swim for the island. Unfortunately, the 100 or so remaining Malagasy people locked in the hold were unable to escape, and sadly went down with the ship, where they drowned. That is literal nightmare fuel for me. I can't imagine being stuck in some box. It's claustrophobic, it's hot, it's dark, and then slowly it starts filling up with water and you drown. That is one of my worst nightmares. That and P. Diddy picking up my son from school. As dawn came, the surviving crew of Malagasy people were able to get a better look at their surroundings, and what they saw was horrifying. Sand Island was a desolate place, barely a kilometre in length, with no trees, no fresh water, and no means of escape. For the 122 surviving crew and enslaved passengers, This tiny rock in the middle of the Indian Ocean became their prison. Now at some point, owing to the enormous pressure Captain Lafargue was under, not only from smuggling slaves illegally to make a quick buck, but also the pressure of the shipwreck itself and leading the survivors on this island, he just checked out. He snapped. He was like, no, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. And thankfully, he was relieved by his first lieutenant and second in command, Barthélemy, who thankfully stepped up and was like, Captain Lafargue, I think you should have a break over there in the sea. Maybe you should off for a bit. I'll take over from here. And it's a good thing he did. The survivors salvaged what they could from the wreck. Barrels of flour, some tools, and thankfully a fair amount of wood. They were able to build a fire, and eventually a forge and an oven. Barthélemy built 2 camps on opposite ends of the island, one for the crew and one for the Malagasy people. Under Barthélemy's stewardship, they began constructing a boat from the ship's remains, which they named the Providence. But they didn't just build a simple raft. No, you'd think you'd build a very basic creation that would just fit everybody on, and as long as it was seaworthy and you could sail to safety, all good, right? No, they built an enormous ship. I mean, can't argue with it, fair play. On the 27th of September 1761, a contingent of 122 French sailors made up of crew and officers left Sand Island aboard the Providence. They left the surviving slaves, 60 Malagasy men and women, promising to return and rescue them. Now, the sailors reached Madagascar in about 4 days before they were eventually transferred onto Reunion Island, and then from there Mauritius. Nice work, lads. Yeah, good one. Now let's go back and rescue those slaves, right? Right? Upon reaching Mauritius, they requested that colonial authorities send a ship to rescue the Malagasy slaves on the island. However, they were met with categorical refusal from the governor, with the justification that France was fighting the 7 Years' War and thus no ship could be spared, the island of Mauritius being itself under threat of attack from British India. Barthélemy returned to France in 1762 and never gave up hope to one day return to the Isle of Sand to save the Malagasy people. He would repeatedly petition the French authorities to send a ship to rescue them, but was met by refusal every time. To Barthélemy's credit, he was persistent, and eventually it would pay off. In 1773, a French ship passing close to Sand Island spotted the Malagasy people and reported back to the French authorities. A boat was sent, and for the first time in 12 years, the Malagasy people stranded on Sand Island could finally sense the end of their ordeal was nearing. For the first time in what must have felt like an eternity, a euphoric sense of relief and optimism washed over the camp. However, it was not to be, as not wanting to risk wrecking on the coral reef as the Utile had done before, the ship aborted its rescue and sailed away. A year later, a second ship also failed to reach the island. During this failed attempt, a sailor managed to swim to the shoreline but had to be abandoned due to bad weather. The sailor became part of the community, and after a couple of years, he decided to make his own escape attempt by building a raft, but was never seen again. It seemed as though all hope was lost. On the morning of the 29th of November, 1776, 15 full years after the sinking, a ship appeared on the horizon. At first, the Malagasy believed it to be a mirage or trick of the light, but as it drew closer, its huge sails blowing in the wind, with the tropical sunlight glinting off its bow, the Malagasy people knew it to be real. The ship was the Dauphine, captained by Tromelin Lanugai. Upon its arrival, the brutal reality of the ordeal became quickly apparent. Of the 60 Malagasy slaves who had survived the original sinking, just 7 remained. 7 women and an 8-month-old baby. Now, when they were found, they were wearing clothes that they had made from the feathers of seabirds they had caught on the island. And perhaps most remarkably of all, They'd kept a fire going for 15 years without any trees on the island. So there was no source of natural wood. You know, they had to salvage bits and pieces off of the ship. And I believe they dried out coral and flotsam and stuff to keep this fire going for 15 years. Can you imagine the kind of pressure that would put you under? All right, Steve, we're going to bed now. It's your turn to watch the fire tonight. Keep an eye out for rain and make sure it doesn't go out. You just be sitting there all night like... If it goes out, that is it. You know, they needed that fire to prepare food and to make repairs and to keep warm and dry. You know, it's an extraordinary thing. 15 years. They had even built sheds and storage and even a kitchen to store and prepare meat that they got from seabirds and turtles and fish around the island. And they built a forge which they used to smelt down metal that they had salvaged from the shipwreck. When archaeologists visited the site later, they found evidence of copper plates that the Malagasy had melted down in their forges to repair bowls and create utensils and stuff like that. They'd even built a lookout tower on the highest point of the island to look out to sea for ships that would hopefully come to their rescue, but sadly never did. For shelter, because there was no natural shelter on the island, they actually dug down into the sand and lived underground with coral stones piled on top that looked sort of like mausoleums. Kind of a dark existence, really. Their shelters were their tombs. It's almost like a metaphor for their struggle on the island. Being from the highlands of Madagascar, they were not trained in how to hunt and farm in an ocean environment, so they had to learn incredibly quickly and pick up these skills and develop them in order to survive. And sadly, most of them would perish in the first couple of months from dehydration, then eventually starvation. But 7 of them made it a full 15 years. And not only that, they brought a baby into it all, which is just an incredible story of persistence and survival. The survivors remain with Jacques Maillart, governor of Mauritius, who declared them free and offered to bring them back to Madagascar, which they refused. And it's no wonder, really, is it? You know, it's like, I'm sorry, governor, that's a really, really kind offer, but I am never getting on another ship for as long as I live, especially with those French kids. Maillart decided to baptize the child Jacques Moïse, which translates to Moses, and to rename his mother Eve, and to do the same with the child's grandmother, whom he called Dauphine after the name of the ship that rescued them. The trio was welcomed in the house of the intendant of Mauritius, where they lived the rest of their lives. Sand Island was renamed Tromelin Island after the name of the ship's captain that rescued them. And that brings us nicely to the end of our story and the end of the episode. This is an incredible tale about strength and resilience of the human spirit. These people were extraordinary, not only to face such insurmountable adversity, but to come out on top against all the odds. So next time you're stuck in a meeting, you know, and it's dragging on a bit and you're feeling a little bit hungry, spare a thought for Sand Island and the Malagasy people who were stranded there in 1760. Thank you so much, guys, for watching. I will catch you in the next one. Peace.